Hello, this is Paul Przytocki with the Windsor-Essex Child and Youth Advocacy Center. Thank you for taking the time to view this presentation on cultural competence, a presentation for servicing diverse populations, building awareness among service providers. So let's get right into it. The Windsor-Essex region is highly diverse, made up of a variety of individuals and families from various ethno-racial and religious backgrounds. For those servicing these populations in the context of child physical and sexual abuse, it is important to take ethno-racial and religious considerations into account. By taking cultural considerations into account during investigations and service delivery, service providers provide more effective services and increase their competencies in understanding, compassion, and inclusivity. There are 5 goals to this presentation, and please note that the information provided in this presentation has been drawn from extensive research within academia and through community consultations within the Windsor-Essex region. The 5 main goals of this presentation are as follows. The first is to increase cultural competency in service providers. The second, promote service providers to take the responsibility of learning about the various ethno-cultural and religious groups they serve. The third is to challenge our personal belief systems. By challenging our personal belief systems, we offer a more inclusive and compassionate process in interventions and service delivery. The fourth, gain an understanding of key terms that directly affect the way investigations and service delivery tasks are carried out. And finally, the 5th goal of this presentation is to understand some common themes that arise when servicing diverse populations and to put these themes into context. The agenda for this presentation will be as follows. An introduction of who we are at the Windsor-Essex Child and Youth Advocacy Center and what we do. Define culture and understand the differences between individualist and collectivist cultures. Define key terms that will assist service providers in their work when working with diverse populations. Conceptualize common themes that arise within collectivist cultures when addressing allegations of child physical and sexual abuse. Identify key points and considerations for service providers and how to approach disclosures, investigations, and service delivery in the context of cultural competency. First, what is a Child and Youth Advocacy Center? We at the Windsor-Essex Child and Youth Advocacy Center believe that children and youth should only have to tell their story once after the initial disclosure. Therefore, after they've provided their statement, they can focus their journey on healing and moving forward in their life. As a process, the CYAC brings together a multidisciplinary team of professionals involved in child abuse investigation, intervention, and treatment. Professionals work together as a team and share information to achieve the best and most accurate outcomes in child abuse cases. Before we proceed, there are certain points to keep in mind. First is that this presentation broadly addresses common themes when servicing diverse populations and is supported by extensive research in the social sciences. Addressing the various nuances and details of various ethnocultures and religious groups is beyond the scope of this project. And as research indicates, which will be discussed later, this is an ongoing task that service providers are tasked with. Developing cultural competency and awareness is an ongoing skill that requires service providers to take the responsibility of educating themselves of the populations that they serve. And finally, it is important to understand our own personal biases and often prejudices, and to challenge these in order to more effectively service various ethno-cultural and religious groups. So first of all, what is culture? On the surface level, when we think of culture, we often define culture in terms of food, music, holidays, festivals, fashion, kind of more of those concrete things that we can perceive. However, culture is much more than these surface level details. We can think of culture almost as an iceberg, where these physical characteristics are on the top and the more abstract details are below the surface level. These can include communication styles, values when it comes to the family, education, child rearing, and various attitudes towards work, competition, and things of this nature. So culture can be defined as a set of values, beliefs, attitudes, and standards of behavior that pass down from one generation to another. Culture is in constant negotiation with itself. It is not static. It changes over time, often over years, decades, and even centuries. Culture is also a perspective that mediates behavior and represents established meanings people act on in any given situation or relationship. So it's safe to say that culture literally guides everything that we do, how we think, and how we behave with each other and in society. Cultural identity is so central to a group and personal identity. And any suggestion that a cultural practice is negative or inappropriate is likely to be sensitive, especially if pressure to change comes from an external actor outside of the group. This is very important for our discussion, and this will be more touched upon in more detail when we talk about cultural safety in our key terms section. Now that we've defined culture, we must understand the differences between individualist and collectivist cultures. Many service providers come from individualist cultures, such as Canada, whereas the diverse populations they serve are from more collectivist cultures, either immigrants or recent descendants of immigrants. So first of all, what is an individualist culture? Individualist cultures emphasize the individual. There is an importance on individual fulfillment and success. Examples of individualist cultures include Canada, the United States, Western Europe, and parts of Central Europe. On the flip side, collectivist cultures, emphasis is placed on the family, community, and society. Personal fulfillment and success are normally on a back burner position, and success is more geared towards the family, community, and society. The values of collectivist cultures have the potential to affect the way families and individuals interact with service providers when allegations of child physical and sexual abuse have been made. Examples of collectivist cultures include Asia, Africa, Middle East, and Eastern Europe. In this section, we will focus on key definitions and terms that are important in providing services. It is important for service providers to take into consideration various concepts when responding to allegations of child physical and sexual abuse in a multicultural context. These concepts include cultural competence, cultural relativism, cultural absolutism, intersectionality, ethnocentrism, acculturative stress, and cultural safety. Cultural competence can be defined as a broad set of behaviors, attitudes, and policies that enable effective work in cross-cultural situations. Cultural competence is a developmental process that evolves over time, is a complex framework, and it comes to the conclusion that there are no textbook linear solutions to solve the complexity of cultural competence. It is an ongoing process. There is no endpoint to cultural competence. It is a lifelong developmental process that involves continuous learning. On the following slide, we provide a detailed framework for practicing cultural competence. This framework includes 4 domains and provides various issues that follow under these 4 dominant domains. First domain is history and experiences of immigration. These issues also include country of origin, length of time in Canada, motivation for immigration, etc. The second domain is experience of acculturation, and we will talk about the acculturative stress soon enough, but for our purposes now, we can understand acculturation as the experiences adjusting to a new culture, feelings and attitudes regarding acculturation, familiarity and comfort with it, Canadian culture, and challenges experienced adjusting to Canadian culture, followed by subsequent issues, which you can read at your leisure. The third domain is family and cultural values. These include family roles and structure, intergenerational family structure, emotional attachment to family members, and again, subsequent issues that you can read at your leisure. Cultural values and belief regarding child maltreatment, which is the final domain, which is key for our purposes here. These include child rearing practices and traditions, cultural beliefs regarding discipline and corporal punishment, and cultural values concerning appropriate physical care and parental supervision, followed by the 3 subsequent issues. Cultural relativism. Now, cultural relativism places cultures on an even playing field. This is not to assume that cultures are the same, but this assumes that it is invalid and unfair to negatively judge a culture based on norms and values of another or our own. All cultures should be viewed in their own right, and cultural standards and sanctioned behaviors cannot be judged by the standards of another culture. This causes us as service providers to understand our own value belief systems and to not extrapolate these belief systems onto others. Cultural absolutism. Cultural absolutism refers to the idea of being culture blind, meaning that in service delivery, service providers treat everyone with the same standard regardless of culture, religion, race, or ethnicity. However, if we recall our definition on culture, culture essentially guides everything that we do. So it is almost an impossible task to be culture blind. It mediates our behavior and our value systems. Therefore, it is very difficult to achieve cultural absolutism as is supported by research. Intersectionality. Intersectionality is a very important concept because it brings to light all the different elements that make up an individual or group's identity. Intersectionality focuses on how different elements and characteristics make up a person or group's identity, and these multiple identities all shape human experiences. There are many variables that make up a person's or a group's collective identity. These include physical environment, individual, familial, and social environment, institutional and structural factors, socio-political context, and subjective perceptions of their environment. Ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is essentially the flip side of cultural relativism. It is the act of comparing, analyzing, and making judgments about another culture based on the values and norms of our own. It also refers to not being aware of our own cultural upbringing and not being aware of our own value systems and coming to the assumptions that our values and norms are applied universally. Now, ethnocentrism does not necessarily imply prejudice or racism. However, if we are unaware of our own cultural values and make these value judgments onto others, this could lead the way towards prejudice or worse, racist attitudes. Acculturative stress. Acculturative stress is a component that may be experienced by those who are going through the acculturation process, such as recent immigrants or descendants of immigrants. It is often referred to as culture shock. And acculturative stress can potentially place great stressors on immigrants. Now, acculturative stress is moderated by numerous variables, such as reason for immigration, economics, and response to the host country, which can all affect the potential for domestic violence and child abuse within the home. And this can also have a direct effect on parenting styles. In order for service providers to more effectively service diverse populations, particularly immigrant or recent immigrant groups, it is important to take into consideration the following migration characteristics: displaced sense of belonging and cultural identity, perceived or experiences of racism and discrimination, socioeconomic situation. loss of, lack of, or isolation from extended family, social, and community supports. This is also a very important point because oftentimes in collectivist cultures, families rely on extended family and their extended social circles in the context of child rearing. So having lost some of these components, many groups may find it stressful when adjusting to these new systems and being without their extended family. Low English proficiency, lack of awareness of available services, fear of authorities, and this point will be touched on later on in this presentation, and unaware of institutions and laws such as child protection laws. And finally, cultural safety. Cultural safety refers to the concept of people from various cultural groups should feel safe in practicing their culture without any outside interference. Essentially, during service provisions, families should feel safe in practicing their culture. They should not feel that their culture is under fire, so to speak. What we need to focus on are the behaviors. Moreover, cultural safety encompasses the idea of power differentials, meaning service providers must be aware of the power they hold in relation to the families they serve, and that these families should not feel that their cultural values and norms are threatened. They should avoid this at all costs. In the context of child and physical and sexual abuse, now this is a very important point. It is important to note that no culture condones these types of abuse. Oftentimes, many of these stereotypes come from snap judgments made. And as will be described later, when factoring in certain variables, culture essentially is not a causal variable in the context of child abuse. So taken collectively, why are these concepts important? These concepts increase our awareness and understanding of various cultural groups. They also increase our own awareness about ourselves and our value systems, which in turn allow us to evaluate our own biases and prejudices. This is important when servicing families in the context of child physical sexual abuse, because although we may have preconceived notions of families from a variety of cultural backgrounds, we cannot allow these to interfere in providing services. Furthermore, if we are to ensure that we are doing our best to serve the best interests of the child or children involved in services, we cannot ignore the importance of taking culture into consideration at all times. This includes investigations, providing other services such as counseling and other types of interventions, as well as court proceedings. Our discussion now turns to common themes that may arise when servicing various ethno-cultural and religious groups, primarily those from collectivist cultures. Now again, it is important to note that no culture condones physical or sexual abuse to any extent. No matter the race, ethnicity, or religion of families, culture is never the causal variable in child abuse of any sort. Many stereotypes of various ethno-cultural groups are more or less byproducts of snap judgments and prejudices that have been over-exaggerated in mainstream media or institutionalized prejudices. It should also be noted that although some ethno-cultural groups are overrepresented in the child protection system, research indicates that when we control for variables such as socioeconomic status, there appears to be little difference in prevalence rates among ethno-cultural groups involved in the child protection system or court systems. Now, it is important for service providers to be aware of the reasons for some resistance within various ethno-cultural groups, because by increasing this awareness, we can provide services and conduct investigations in the most culturally competent way, thus facilitating a more inclusive and open process. The information provided in the following sections is drawn from social science research and community consultations with various individuals who work directly with children and youth who have been abused. The common themes to be discussed in this section include honor, shame, and the role of religion, issues with disclosure, stigma of mental health, stigma associated with state intervention, use of punitive discipline as a means of character building and protection, and finally, intergenerational and historical trauma. Honor, shame, and the role of religion. Religion often ingrains a collectivist moral guise within families by believing in a higher power over the community or the society. Therefore, honor, shame, and the role of religion play a major role in the disclosures, responses, and interventions that are used in child and youth sexual abuse. Shame and honor often play a role in inhibiting, recanting, or changing disclosure of sexual abuse within collectivist cultures because of the shame that disclosure may bring to the family. Shame after sexual abuse can be conceptualized in three ways. The first is failure to protect. In highly patriarchal, religious cultures, for example, there is an element of shame that comes from the males in the family failing to protect the women. The second is fate. Fate, or an external locus of control, which essentially means forces beyond our control, dictate that the abuse was meant to be or due to God's will or karma. And third, damaged goods. Many religious and ethno-racial groups place a high importance on virginity. Therefore, children and youth may be apprehensive to disclose sexual abuse due to this cultural expectation. Issues with disclosure. Now, this can not only applies to sexual abuse, but can also be applied to physical abuse as well. And disclosure of abuse, especially sexual abuse, is very difficult for any victim, regardless of culture. However, due to cultural norms, values, and mores, in other words, customs, especially in regards to sexuality, disclosure is discouraged or inhibited altogether. There are a multitude of factors that influence disclosure. For example, support from caregivers, neurocognitive development at the time of abuse, feelings of shame, sexual abuse or sexuality in general seen as a taboo subject, particularly in highly religious groups. Sex and sexuality are simply not topics of discussion. Differential power dynamics in the family or community, and finally, availability of services. Now, according to research, there are 4 key factors that influence whether disclosure occurs or not, and how these disclosures can potentially be handled by the family. These 4 key factors will have a direct effect on how families respond to the investigation and service delivery processes. These key factors include placing responsibility on the victim, fear of communal rejection, loss of economic support, and again, we will arrive to this theme of honor and shame. The first, placing responsibility on the victim. The idea that children and youth are responsible for their abuse, particularly in cases of sexual abuse, is often a defense mechanism used by adults for their feelings of not being able to protect the child or youth. There is a common theme, particularly within highly religious groups, that sexual abuse does not occur unless it is invited. Furthermore, many traditional religious groups place the responsibility on the victim to initiate some sort of restorative peace within the community or top clergy members. It is important to note that this theme is not exclusive to highly traditional religious groups, but it is a common victim blaming statement that is pervasive in society in general, regardless if the culture is collectivist or individualist. An example of how pervasive this can be is the victim blaming that may occur on university campuses in the United States and Canada, for example. Fear of communal rejection. Now, communal rejection is a major cause of concern in collectivist cultures. In some groups, particularly highly religious groups, if sexual abuse is disclosed to the community, families and/or victims could possibly be exiled from their community. In very extreme cases, The perpetrator could be exiled from the community. However, sometimes this family member could be a key family member that is possibly the breadwinner of the family. This point will be touched on momentarily in more detail. Furthermore, family members and/or victims may be reluctant to disclose abuse due to the fear of being stereotyped by the larger community outside of their group based on their ethno-racial background. Moreover, in many collectivist groups, there's an expectation of conformity to standardized norms. And if sexual abuse is reported to government authorities and/or someone is labeled as having a mental illness, this could result in exile from the community due to deviating from the norm in a substantial way. Loss of economic support. In many collectivist cultures that are highly religious and operate on traditional gender norms, if the abuser is the breadwinner of the family, for example, a father or uncle, there is a potential to lose that source of income. Consequently, if the abuser is sentenced, the family can fall into poverty and experience an extreme change in the family system that comes with a great deal of other issues. This is not only applicable to traditional religious groups, but any group where the sole income earner is the abuser and is ultimately handed down a sentence. Now, although social service supports exist for the families in these cases, many families are unaware of the availability of these services, thus are hesitant to formally report abuse to authorities. Note that this information was provided by individuals who have worked directly in investigation and also in service delivery capacities. We again arrive to this theme of honor and shame. The role of honor and shame in the context of abuse has already been discussed. However, in the context of abuse disclosure, it is important to note the importance these themes have. Shame and honor have a huge role in inhibiting disclosure and reporting among collectivist cultures. Sex and sexuality are often taboo subjects within traditionalist collectivist cultures. Therefore, victims are often highly reluctant to disclose this abuse. Furthermore, in terms of sexual education, these discussions are often not had between parents and children or within these communities. Therefore, this added pressure makes it enormously difficult for children and youth to disclose sexual abuse to anyone within their communities. We now turn to this idea of stigma of mental health. In Western societies, mental health services and mental health awareness has increased in recent years. And when Westerners struggle with mental illness, society highly encourages them to seek help, and the advocacy efforts of many mental health organizations are very strong and are increasing. In many collectivist parts of the world, however, mental health carries a large stigma. And in many cases, mental health is simply not an issue. Therefore, it is important for service providers to appreciate this and approach the topic of mental health with great sensitivity and consideration. Now, the basic principles of counseling and psychotherapy, such as individualism, determination, and self-fulfillment, are in direct conflict with many collectivist ideologies. Remember, in collectivist cultures, society, the community, and the family take precedent over the individual. So to be labeled with a mental illness in many traditional collectivist cultures carries a large stigma, and it is often not only placed on the individual, but the entire family unit. If mental illness is discussed in any way, shape, or form, it should be done with great sensitivity, compassion, and understanding. Moreover, service providers should also take into consideration the possibility of incorporating traditional cultural healing mechanisms in their interventions, as well as including highly respected individuals within those communities, reinforcing this idea of the collectivist community. These individuals can include clergymen, imams, traditional healers, etc. Stigma associated with state intervention. In Western individualist societies, state intervention in a broad range of areas of social and economic life is normal. However, in many other parts of the world, this is simply not the case, particularly in matters relating to the family. Although in some countries that have highly authoritarian governments that have strict rule over areas such as the economy, matters relating to the family typically remain in the family. Now, this is not to assume that this is always the case, but it is often the case. Furthermore, depending where families originate, state intervention is often associated with oppression, persecution, and oftentimes violence. Examples of these could be countries that have recently experienced civil war. Therefore, it is important to bear in mind that those who represent the state may face great resistance when servicing these populations. But it is important to note that this resistance comes from a state of fear. Now, those who come from collectivist cultures are often accustomed to literally no government involvement in child rearing practices, and some may struggle to adapt to raising their children in a Western country with individualistic values and a commitment from government to protect children from corporal punishment and sexual abuse. Furthermore, in highly traditional religious groups, there is a tendency to keep all matters, including child abuse, within the community, and measures are taken, such as restorative justice, to ensure there is no intervention on behalf of state authorities. So some groups want to keep all matters within their community and do not want any state actors intervening. For migrant groups, there is potential for state intervention to be a very scary experience, which often comes from prior experiences with the state in their countries of origin. Again, returning to this idea of states that have recently, and by recently we mean in the last several decades, experienced civil war. Use of punitive discipline as a means of character building and protection. Punitive discipline or corporal punishment is certainly not exclusive to certain ethnocultural groups. However, there appears to be a theme that corporal punishment is a means to correct behavior, build character, and according to research, is used as a means to protect children and youth in various situations. An example of this are those who come from countries that have recently experienced war. It is important to note that parents who use these types of disciplinary practices are mostly highly affectionate and care for their children. Therefore, it is important for service providers to act as educators and facilitators to ensure that parents correct these practices. And according to many consultations that took place, parents, more often than not, are open to correcting these patterns of behavior. Now, as has been stated throughout this presentation, no culture or religion condones the malicious abuse of children in the name of discipline, culture, or religion. However, corporal punishment is still used, and it is used in every group. In many ethnocultural groups, however, corporal punishment is seen as an acceptable means to correct behavior and instill discipline. Again, however, when educative services have been provided, parents, more often than not, are susceptible to this and are willing to correct the behavior. Families from various migrant groups where their home country do not have stringent child protection systems, such as Canada, immigrant families are completely unaware of the child protection system and child protection law. Therefore, this increases the likelihood of state intervention in their new country, just due to the lack of awareness of laws pertaining to child protection. Now, in many collectivist cultures, punitive discipline is seen as a form of character building. And these parents, again, more often than not, do so because they want what's best for their children. Furthermore, in some groups, parents may use punitive discipline with a symbolic effect. An example is steal something results in a slap on the wrist, swearing results in a slap on the mouth. However, the intention is the correction of unacceptable behavior. In regards to religion, there are common misconceptions and prejudicial ideas that various religious groups condone the use of corporal punishment. However, this is simply not the case, and those who justify corporal punishment often do so by manipulating religious verses to rationalize this disciplinary method. Again, culture and religion are not used as justifications for abuse. Now, this section is also tied to the next section on historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. Many countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia had experienced colonial rule up until the 1960s. Therefore, the experiences of being under colonial rule are highly ingrained in older generations, and as the next section on intergenerational trauma will point, these sentiments can be passed down from one generation to the next if there is no intervention to break the cycle. For our purposes in discussing punitive discipline, since many immigrant groups come from countries who were under colonial rule, punitive discipline was used to ensure the safety of children and to make sure they obey their colonial masters in order to avoid serious repercussions that today would be considered crimes against humanity. Historical trauma and intergenerational trauma transmission. This section primarily focuses on the historical oppression and trauma that has been passed down from generation to generation within Indigenous and African American communities. The reason for focusing on these groups is due to how these groups are disproportionately represented in child protection systems in both Canada and the United States. This section will also focus on how physical and sexual abuse has intergenerational effects, which contributes to a continuous cycle of abuse within families from one generation to another, especially when factoring in certain variables, which will be discussed later on. Historical trauma. Historical trauma is rooted in two pre-existing concepts: historical oppression and psychological trauma, meaning that when a group has been faced with historical oppression over decades and even centuries, combined with the psychological trauma of oppression, slavery, genocide, if these psychological effects are not addressed through effective interventions, there is a strong possibility that these effects will be passed down to the next generation. For African Americans, after over 300 years of slavery, poverty, segregation, and oppression, the effects of these experiences have the potential to be passed down and will continue to be passed down unless effective culturally appropriate interventions are put into place. Essentially, these ideas are ingrained. Furthermore, after centuries of a master-slave relationship, this became a social template for all relationships and interactions between African Americans and non-African Americans, and even became a template for parenting. Now, the end of slavery in both Canada and the United States did not represent an end to African Americans' oppression and discrimination. After slavery, African Americans were constantly segregated, raped, castrated, and lynched all the way up to the civil rights movement. And even today, African Americans are highly represented in the impoverished populations and have faced discrimination inside and outside the workplace. And as we see the protests occurring across Canada, the United States, and even parts of Europe in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, we cannot ignore these ideas anymore. They must be addressed. This discussion on African American historical trauma is essential for service providers to understand. And in order for service providers to better serve these populations, service providers need to have a better appreciation and empathetic understanding of the historical trauma that African Americans have been exposed to. In regards to Indigenous groups in Canada, in order to better understand these populations, service providers must understand how these experiences of colonialism have shaped these populations' current situations. The effects of trauma from colonialism have been passed down from one generation to the next. And we are now starting to have a better understanding that the legacy of colonialism is a major cause of social problems among Indigenous populations today. Hartman and Gahn describe the 4 C's of Indigenous historical trauma. The first is colonial injury. The second, collective experience. The third, cumulative effects. And the fourth, cross-generational effects. Now, in order for service providers to better service these populations, it is important for them to have an awareness that although colonialism ended over a century and a half ago, Indigenous groups continued to face immense oppression and discrimination. Examples include the residential school system, the 60s scoop, many could argue the early 2000s millennial scoop, and these effects are being passed down through the generations. When a group of people have experienced decades and even centuries of colonial rule, slavery, and oppression, there's a chance that cultures who were once victimized by these systems pass the effect of trauma through their parenting. And as you can see, this point is highly supported by research. Furthermore, parents have inherited cultural traditions that have been passed down through the generations that were based on the master-slave, colonized-colonizer relationship. Again, these are ingrained in their consciousness. And we need to address them and start appreciating it much more. Intergenerational abuse. When it comes to intergenerational effects of abuse in general, when factoring variables such as poverty, mental health, and substance abuse, there is without a doubt an intergenerational effect. Now, just because one generation may have been abused by their parents does not mean that that generation will abuse the subsequent generation. That is not a strict linear causal situation. However, when we include these variables such as poverty, mental health, and substance abuse, there is an increased risk of abuse being passed down from one generation to another. So now, considering all the points in this presentation, in her book, Working with Ethnic Minorities and Across Cultures in Western Child Protection Systems, Sawriker endorses the following considerations when working with diverse populations. First and foremost, any practice that is harmful to children and youth should never be justified in the name of culture and/or religion. Subsequently, culture is not also a causal variable to abuse. Service providers act as educators for parents who engage in certain child-rearing practices and do so in a respectful way so as to not further disempowerment. Subjectivity and assessments should be practiced and valued in order to better service diverse populations. Service providers should not be fearful of discussions on culture and racism, but by acknowledging these, they can actually facilitate a more efficient and harmonious outcome by working with the families. Many groups come from collectivist cultures that value strong family and community cohesion. And we as service providers should praise these groups for these value systems. In order to understand the cultural group, service providers should use cultural information and not negatively stereotype them. Also, involve all members of the family, even extended family if necessary. Although this may be limited if a family member is the accused abuser. However, if that is not the case, by involving other members of the family may contribute to a more harmonious and inclusive outcome. Emphasize confidentiality and that all matters will be kept within interested parties in order to ignore or prevent stigmatization from the community, or as discussed earlier, exile from their own community. Must consider acculturative effects coupled with culture. Service providers distribute information in native language as best as possible. And finally, it is also important to consider how much culture is appropriate in evaluations and investigations. In clear-cut cases where there has been major harm, obviously, there can only be so much culture involved in the considerations in evaluations and investigations. Now, it is important to note that the 5 most common risk factors for child abuse are domestic violence, alcohol and substance use, mental health in caregivers, housing issues, and financial issues. Culture is not considered a risk factor. So, in conclusion, cultural competency is an ongoing skill that is a lifelong journey and requires non-racist attitudes, willingness for self-reflection, having culture awareness and knowledge, which is an ongoing developmental process, having a sense of efficacy to work in culturally diverse communities, empathy and understanding of others, respectful engagement, expressed interest, efficient and responsive practice, regular contact, and the provision of support and information. And finally, meeting face-to-face time to engage with families. On behalf of the Windsor-Essex Child and Youth Advocacy Center, I want to thank you for your time, and I sure hope that we are striving towards increasing our awareness in order to better service diverse populations. Thank you very much.